Morning. If you got a Bible, Amos chapter 7. Amos chapter 7. That's over there by Obadiah, if you're looking for it. Man, these decorations are great, aren't they? I can say that because I didn't do anything to help. But whoever did, man, these are awesome. I've been pushing for stained glass in this building for a long time, and we finally got some. Apparently, we're looking for a jester back there in the back, and he looks familiar. I don't know. Maybe we can find him. These decorations look great. VBS starts tomorrow. Here's my experience. They're going to look great tomorrow, but after a bunch of kids are running through on Monday night, Tuesday, some of these walls are going to fall down a little bit. And we'll put them back. We'll put them back. And some of the, maybe our moat back there is going to get a little messy, and the drawbridge chains may get broken, and we'll put them back. We'll take care of it. That's Monday. Tuesday, we take a little less care in putting those things back together. And by Wednesday night, when we're looking at it, and we've been doing this for a long time, and you can see the walls have fallen down, and some of the decorations are just off, we'll probably get to the point where we say, it's good enough, right? It's good enough for one more night. It's good enough. Good enough is good enough, I guess, for the last night of Vacation Bible School. But when the walls are coming down in life, when everything's falling apart in our lives, then good enough is not good enough. This is what Amos is talking about in Amos chapter 7. Amos is a prophet. He didn't mean to be a prophet. He is not from a school of prophets. They would have had those. Amos, the Old Testament prophet, did not come from a family of prophets. His dad's not a prophet. His brothers aren't prophets. He's just a farmer. He's a fig tree farmer. He's a herdsman from a little place called Tekoa, which probably most of us, me included, we've never heard of Tekoa. It's a few miles outside of Jerusalem. It's in the south land there. And Amos, again, was not supposed to be a prophet. He was supposed to be a farmer. But Amos is called by God, and Amos is going to have this message of God that he's going to take to a group of people. The group of people that he brings this message to, they're not really his people. Amos is from the south, several generations before the time of Amos. There was a kind of a civil war among God's people, and you had the divided kingdom. Maybe you've heard about that. You had Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Well, Amos is from Judah in the south. He's from Tekoa in Judah in the south. And God calls him, not a prophet, right? He's not supposed to be doing this, but God calls him anyway. And he goes up to the north, and he has a message from the south for those people in the north. Can you imagine what that would have been like in our country? We're not that far removed from a civil war ourselves. And can you imagine the response of somebody from down in the south and somebody from up in the north comes down and says, let me tell you what y'all need to get right in your lives? That probably wouldn't go over very well, would it? Probably not from the south going up to the north. People would probably say, what's this uneducated hillbilly coming up here trying to tell us about? I would imagine that is kind of the response that the folks are going to have towards somebody like Amos. It is a time, Amos's time is a time of prosperity and peace among lots of the people of God, but there is a sense in which that prosperity and peace came at the expense of an underclass, of a lot of people who are dealing with economic hardships and struggles, and their life is anything but peaceful. Both of those people are included in the people of God at this time. And so let's talk a little bit about what Amos is charged with going and saying to these people. John read for us a couple of verses already, but I want to read them again. It's important, I think, that we see what's happening here. Amos chapter 7, verse 7 begins like this. This is what he showed me. So this is Amos getting a vision from God. He said, behold, the Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line. The wall was already built with a measurement, with a plumb line to show, is the wall straight or not? And the wall was straight when the wall was built. The wall was built with a plumb line. That's important for us to see. And he's got a plumb line. God has a plumb line in his hand, all right? And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, well, I see a plumb line. And the Lord said, behold, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by. Well, let me stop right here and say, you may read that as kind of harsh. And maybe you should read that as kind of harsh. But I hope to show you at some point in this lesson that it's actually loving and gracious and merciful what God is going to do here, okay? Not going to pass by anymore. The high places of Isaac will be made desolate. The sanctuaries of Israel will be laid waste. And I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. Now, there are a couple more characters in these verses. We're not going to read all this. There's a man named Amaziah. Amaziah is the priest who has the ear of the king, Jeroboam. And you get the ear of the king by saying what the king wants to hear and not running against the king. So whatever you say, king, yes, the word of God backs you up. That's Amaziah. And Amaziah is going to say to Amos, you need to get out of here. You are no longer welcome with your kind of talk around our people. The king doesn't need to hear this. You're treasonous. You are threatening and uprising against this king, so you need to get out of here. That's the response. And Amos says, I get your response, but listen, I'm telling you the word of the Lord. I'm setting a plumb line in the middle of my people to see if they're straight or not, to see if they're still lining up or not, to see if they've gotten a little off, a little bit crooked. That's the goal of Amos the prophet. Now, this is not a moment of divine rage or anything like that. This is a moment of divine clarity. This is Amos coming and revealing a message of God. This is their moment of truth to figure out where they stand. How are things lining up in their lives, in their communities, when they picture it against the word of God. They're measuring their existence as God's people, as God's nation, against God's law. And it's not the first time. Amos says that this wall that we're examining here, it was built with a plumb line. The people were built with the word of God. This was when they came out of Egypt and they assemble at Mount Sinai, and God gives them the law, and the law tells them how they are to live their lives. They were built according to that standard, but Amos has the responsibility to go with the message of God and say, you're a little out of whack. You're a little off center. You're not exactly straight anymore. Your lives have become a little bit crooked. This is what happens when a nation or a people or a person becomes out of line with the purpose that God has created them for. And the temptation at that point, when we become out of line, when we're not exactly what we were created to be, when we aren't living like we're supposed to be living, the tendency then is kind of like on the final night of Vacation Bible School to look at what we've got and say, well, it's good enough. It'll do in a pinch. It'll do for now. I know it's not exactly straight, it's a little bit crooked, but mostly straight is probably going to be good enough. Well, God says no more. That's the message of Amos, not because he's cruel. All right, we're going to read a few passages in a minute. And you may read these as cruel messages from God. They are not that. This is the love of God expressed to them so that they can see what is true and real. This is the love of God expressed to them so they can make the needed changes in their lives. A lot of times when we talk about the wrath of God, we're talking about God's loving words, God's gracious words and merciful words and actions wrongly received. That's what's happening here. He is telling them the truth, and this is good. He is showing them what is real, and that is good. They're going to receive it as wrathful, but this is given out of God's love and grace and mercy. Okay, Amos chapter 5. Let's back up a couple of chapters here. And we're going to run through a string of verses real quick. It's not going to take a lot of time here. What I want you to notice is that the people that Amos is charged with going and sharing this message with, they hadn't quit going to church. All right? Sometimes in our mind we think, well, the marker of faithfulness is how many times we show up at the building. These people had not stopped. We're going to see that. They were still attending the services. They were making the offerings and the sacrifices. They were going through the rites and the rituals. They were doing all the stuff that they had always done, but something was missing. Something was still hollow about their worship. Amos chapter 5, verse 21, he says, I despise your feasts. Those feasts were commanded by God. They would have no idea about what the feast was or when they were to celebrate it or what they were to celebrate in the feast if God didn't tell them. But now God says, I can't stand your feasts. I can't stand your communings when you all come together. He said, I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. God commanded those. He's the one who said, y'all need to come together and assemble and have a congregation here. And he said, I can't stand it. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. And here's why. Because even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings commanded by God, that's Leviticus, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings and your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. He commanded them. Verse 23, take away from me the noise of your songs, to the melody of your harps I will not listen, but let justice, this is what he wants. Not interested in the feasts, in the offerings, and the sacrifices, and the fat animals, or the songs that you sing. Just give me justice, rolling down like the waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. See, they were still going to worship. They were still singing the songs, making the sacrifices, going through the acts of worship. They were still doing it. And God said, I wish you'd stop, because what I really want is justice and righteousness. I want you to live a just, right life, and I want you to do right by other folks. What God was getting from them was a kind of justice that did not, or a kind of worship that did not lead to justice. Singing the songs, but not living the life. Let's go a chapter before this. Chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Hear this word, cows of Bashan who are on the mountains of Samaria, who oppress the poor and crush the needy, who say to your husbands, bring that we may drink. Bring us something to drink. Keep us happy. The Lord has sworn by holiness that, behold, the days are coming upon you when they'll take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks. This is rough language. This is the word of the Lord that comes through Amos. It's brutal, but it's not random. What Amos is saying is that your luxury, your affluence, has hardened your hearts. Let's go to chapter 6. Amos chapter 6, verse 1. Woe to those who are at ease in Zion, and to those who feel secure on the mountain of Samaria, the notable men of the first of the nations to whom the house of Israel comes. Let's skip down to verse 4. Woe to those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall. They sing idle songs and the sounds of the harp, and like David, invent for themselves instruments of music, and drink wine in bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but they are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. They hadn't stopped worshiping, but their worship had turned inwards. They had redefined what it means to be righteous and just and holy in their lives. And for them, it became, well, we just go and we offer up the sacrifices and sing the songs and do the good deeds on the Sabbath day, and then we go and we just live our lives afterwards. And sometimes folks would come and try to deal truthfully with them. And in chapter 5, verse 10, you read these words, they hate the one who reproves in the gates, and they abhor the one who speaks truth to them. Nobody come and tell us what we're doing wrong. That's the mindset. Just let us go ahead. Let us do what we're doing. We're still making the worship services. We're still offering the sacrifices. Leave us alone and let us live our lives. Go to chapter 8. A couple more, and then we'll try to make it real for us. Chapter 8, verse 4. He says, hear this, you who trample on the needy. Are you starting to see where God's heart is here? It's not so much in the feast and in the assemblings and in the sacrifices and the offerings or in the songs. You who trample on the needy, hear this, and bring the poor of the land to an end, saying, when will this new moon be over? When is it going to be over that we can go sell grain? And the Sabbath, that we may offer wheat for sale. When are these holy days going to be over? Yes, I'll go to church. Yes, I'll sit in the assembly. I'll go through the worship service and things like that. But when in the world is it going to be over? so that I can go sell my grain and my wheat. Okay, maybe it doesn't sound so bad until you read the next line. Let's go out there and let's make the ephah small and the shekel great, and let's go deal deceitfully with false balances. This is the picture of a person who's going to church, going to worship, but when they leave here, they leave their religion in that place, and they go and they just practice whatever in the world they want to practice for the rest of their lives. And they're going to come back next week, and they're going to make the sacrifices and sing the songs and offer the prayers and do all that religious stuff, but they're going to go out and live all week however in the world they want to live. Let's go out and make some money by dealing deceitfully with our neighbor, with false balances, that we, verse 6, may buy the poor, that we may purchase the poor people. That's how you ought to read it. For silver, and that we may purchase the needy people for shoes and sell the chaff of the wheat. Even their worship calendar was just a waiting room for their next chance at deceiving people and making money. They were religious. You'd look at every one of them and say, what a religious person that is. They were very religious. But their religion was shaped more by the cultural norms and the dominant ways of life, their influences around them, than it was by the word of God. In short, they kept the form of faith. Their lips were honoring God, but their hearts were far from Him, and their hearts were far from the people that needed them around them. Okay, that's Amos's message in a nutshell. That's what he says. That's what he comes to speak, and he speaks it. And it doesn't go well for Amos. This is not in the Bible, but Jewish tradition says that Amos would later be executed because he brought this kind of message. It's still a message that we need. This is not a message that's just about economic policies. It's about what Paul describes in the New Testament as the flesh versus the spirit. Right? They're warring with one another. Christianity we've always taught that we personally, our lives are shaped by either the spirit or the flesh. That we will walk by the flesh, or we will we'll walk by the spirit, or we will gratify the desires of the flesh. We don't talk as much about that anymore, but that's what's happening in the book of Amos. Left to themselves, they had come out of whack. They weren't plumb anymore. They were a little bit crooked. And they looked at their lives and say, it'll do. It's okay. They said about their lives and their religion what we say about decorations on the third day of VBS. It's good enough. It'll do for now. They did not want anybody coming to tell them that they needed to straighten up. And when somebody did, they put him to death. What I think we need to know this morning is that it's good for us to hear what is true. It is good for us to see, to think about our lives, the language of Paul, to examine ourselves, to see how we line up. There are all these great passages that Paul writes about how we should view ourselves. And his most common theme is that he says that we should view ourselves in relation to Jesus the Christ. You'll read several times where Paul says, imitate me as I try to imitate Christ. And you'll read times where Paul just clearly says, you should be like Jesus, conformed into the image of Jesus. Imitate God as you see Jesus dying on the cross. That's Paul's language, that we, if we're looking for a plumb line, to see what we're stacking up like, we're not looking at the law anymore. That's what Amos brought to them. We're not looking at the law, we're looking at God in the flesh, Jesus the Christ. We look at his life, and we decide how we line up, where we're similar, and where we are a little bit crooked from what he looks like. Jesus is our plumb line. He is God's righteousness and God's justice made visible. In Colossians 1, verse 15, Paul writes that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. In Hebrews 1, the Hebrews writer says that Jesus is the express image of God. In other words, he is what God looks like. When you look at Jesus, when you read about Jesus, and you read about his actions in the world, that is what God acts like. When you read about Jesus and how he responds to to people in his life. That's how God responds to people. When you read about Jesus and how he welcomes the outsiders, that's how God feels about the outsiders. When you see Jesus and his care for the poor and the needy and the helpless, that's what God expects out of us with regard to the poor and the needy and the helpless. When you hear the words of Jesus, when you read the words of Jesus, you are reading what God has to say. And so Jesus is the image of God, the express image of God. He is what God looks like. He is how God acts. He is what God has to say. And he gives us a convenient way to see how we line up, how we are imitating God, how we are imitating the example of Jesus. We look at him like we look at a mirror, and we see how we stack up and where we have a little bit of crookedness in our lives. And in Jesus, we see what is true. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and we see maybe the changes that we need to make in our lives. I don't think it should come across harsh. I don't think, us saying, there's some things I need to do better and straighten up, and I got some rough around the edges that need to be smoothed out, and I got some crooked areas that need to be made straight, and there are places where I'm out of line and I need to get back on track. That's not supposed to be harsh. All right, if it comes across as harsh or wrathful, it's because I'm receiving God's loving, gracious, merciful, true message in the wrong way. Amos does not end on that note. If you go to chapter 9, this ends in a somewhat positive way. There's judgment. There's truth and reality throughout this whole thing. The whole message is there for the people of God then and us today to figure out, how do we stack up? Where do we line up, and where are we a little bit off? But he doesn't end that way. If you go to the very last passage in the book, Amos chapter 9, verse 11, after the judgment that is not the final word, in that day, verse 11, I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen, and I will, God says, repair its breaches and raise up its ruin and rebuild it as in the days of old. And he continues there with a message of hope, a promise that will end his book. But it's telling to me that God says, look, this whole message is about seeing where we line up, seeing what changes we ought to make, encouraging us to make those changes, but also promising us and reminding us, giving us hope that in the end, he's going to repair what's broken. And he's going to restore what's been lost. And he's going to rebuild, at the end of Amos, the ruined cities. And he concludes by saying, I'm going to plant you back on your land so that you can grow and you can bear fruit. God's final word is not destruction, it's reconstruction. His final word is not judgment, it is promise and it is hope, because the God who breaks is also the God who builds. The God who disciplines us and shows us where we need to line up a little better is also the God who restores us. If we are willing to take him at his word, if we're willing to look honestly at ourselves and compare our lives to the life of Jesus, compare our words to the words of Jesus, our actions to the actions of Jesus, our character to the character of Jesus. If we're willing to look and see how we line up and make the effort to imitate him in our lives, then God will restore and repair what is broken. We can no longer, as the people in Amos' day did, we can no longer sit around and just assume that mostly straight or kind of lining up is good enough. It's okay on the final night of VBS. That is not okay with our lives. But truthfully, it's kind of tempting. It's easy to get used to almost. It's easy to get used to good enough without really making any changes that I need to make in my life. It's easy to revert to, well, I'm better than some others. It's simple for me to say, well, kind of like everybody else. Or sometimes we even think, this is how God made me and I'm just going to have to deal with this. But what if God wants to show us what's out of line? What if every opportunity we get to read about Jesus and think about Jesus and see Jesus is an opportunity for us to think about what is out of line in our lives? Not to condemn us, but to restore us. Not to shame us, but to help us find the healing that we need to restore what's broken in our lives. And so this morning, I think Jesus stands before us as a plumb line. And the question is not whether we measure up or not. The question is, what are we going to do when we realize that we don't? The question on the screen is a good one that I want to leave you with. What part of our lives have we gotten used to just good enough? Is there an area of your life where you realize and you know deep down, this is not right? But it's your one thing. And so there's not a whole lot of effort to fix it, correct it, change it, because it's just my one thing. And the rest of me is pretty good. And so we get used to good enough. What part of our lives have we learned to live with just a little bit crooked? And if you've got something in your mind, I don't know, anger, greed, envy, jealousy, gossip, lust, whatever it might be, if you got something in your mind of what part of your life you've kind of learned to live with as crooked, what would it look like today if you were going to get that part back in line? If you were going to straighten up what's tilted a little bit, what's leaning a little bit? If you were going to cut off those rough edges that don't look like Jesus at all, what would that look like for you today? Where have we gotten used to good enough? And today, would you trust the loving hands of God to make it right? Maybe you're here today and you're ready to become a Christian and begin this walk with the Lord where you recognize Him as the way and you try to live your life in that way, the true way that leads to life. Maybe you begin today by being baptized into Christ, united in His death, coming up out of the water to live this new kind of life, free from sin, free from guilt, and ready to begin this journey of following Him. Maybe you've been following Him for a while, but there are things that are out of kilter a little bit, a little off, a little misaligned, some rough edges that need to be cut off, or some parts of your life that are just a little bit crooked right now. What would it look like for you today to decide that you're going to get these things back to straight?